The metaphor is somewhat worn out, but it remains nonetheless valid. Ancient Iraq or Mesopotamia is one of the cradles of civilization. Sites in the Iraqi south, such as Uruk and Ur, were the first cities in human history and the birthplace of writing. And in northern Iraq, at sites such as Nimrud and Nineveh, archaeologists uncovered the capitals of what was probably the first empire in world history, Assyria, with palaces and temples that have produced some of the most spectacular works of art from antiquity. Some of the pieces, as you all know, housed here in London, not in this house here, but in the British Museum. And Nineveh has also produced the first universal library in human history. The Iraqi sites, as we have heard in the previous communication by Dr. Curtis, have actually been pretty well protected and were rather safe in the years between the 1920s and 1980 or 1990. Since then, however, due to war and political chaos, they have suffered quite extensively and have seen a lot of illicit digging, especially after the US-led invasion in 2003. Much of this illicit digging, however, was concentrated in the south of Iraq, such as at the site of Umar, which you can see here, whereas the north, the region around Mosul, was in fact mostly affected not so much by deliberate destruction or digging, but simply by neglect. You see here on this slide from 2001, Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh with the tin roof that protected it actually removed, exposing sculpture like that to the weather. But in recent years, the situation had actually improved, enabling members of the University of Mosul to engage in new excavations at Nineveh, such as the ones documented on that slide here, which were undertaken between 2010 and 2012. Now, as we've heard before, on June 10th, 2014, the Islamic State, or ISIS, invaded the city, took the city of Mosul, and brought all these hopeful developments to an abrupt stop. It immediately closed down the Mosul Museum, turning it into an administrative center to administer the zakat tax. It closed down most university departments, forcing academics to flee the city and to reassemble in Erbil, and especially in Dohuk, where the kind of Azaz University was created. It also engaged in humanitarian acts that are deplorable, and I won't talk about them, but obviously they are a major concern as well. And they started a campaign of cultural cleansing that was initially directed mostly against Islamic and to lesser degree Christian sites, such as, and this kind of there was a key moment on July 24th, 2014, the explosion of the mosque of the prophet Jonah or Yunus at the site of Nineveh, which was actually not a Shiite site. It was actually, this is a Sunni site, which shows the degree of radicalism that the organization displays. A video released on February 25th, 2015 has now shown us, was the first one to show us that the destructive activities were not just geared against Islamic Christian, but also against pre-Islamic sites. The video showed destructions in two areas, the Nergal Gate area at Nineveh in the north of the city, where a winged bull was attacked with a drill, and several other bulls. I won't show you this, maybe won't show you the video, I should just show you a couple of stills, were massively damaged. And secondly, at the aforementioned Mosul Museum, where a number of Assyrian slabs were apparently destroyed, but more importantly, statues of deities and kings from the ancient city of Hatra, a post-Assyrian site from the Roman Parthian period, were destroyed, were toppled, and then essentially destroyed through the use of sledgehammers. Some blog posts have claimed that these destructions happened actually already last summer, but the information that I received from a source in Mosul, it actually happened briefly before the video in February was released. Obviously, our information on these acts and other acts still vary provisional. There are no independent journalists or scholars really on the ground, and we have to be careful what we are saying here, but the overall picture that emerges becomes increasingly clear, and it is quite obvious that in the aftermath of the destruction at Mosul, at Nineveh, other sites were likewise attacked by ISIS. But before I say that, I should just briefly mention one problem with the Mosul Museum is that we do not actually know exactly which artifacts were housed there. I show you two objects here, this Assyrian sculpture from the reign of Sargon II and this sarcophagus from one of the Assyrian queen's tombs from Nimrud that were housed once in Nimrud, and it isn't entirely clear whether they were evacuated to Baghdad in 2003 or were still kept in the Mosul Museum. So one problem we're facing is that we have not enough information about what was, for instance, in the Mosul Museum. On March 5th, information was released by ISIS, and not yet by ISIS, but actually by independent sources, about the destruction, the partly destruction of the site of Nimrud, another Assyrian capital. This was not originally documented, and the extent of the damage remained unclear. In the aforementioned video, though, released just last Saturday on April 11th, it became clear that presumably a few weeks later, Nimrud, in fact, was more or less obliterated, at least the site of the palace of Assurbanipal, which is particularly deplorable because this was, in fact, the only Assyrian palace that was in a way visitable on the ground, and after apparently some slices of reliefs had been taken away by ISIS, they simply detonated the site, of which in fact nothing is left. Information from March 6th claimed that the site of Hatra was likewise massively damaged. Original reports were about explosions having been heard. A video released on April 4th doesn't show the dynamiting of the very remarkable temples at that site, but it does show attacks on sculpture such as this hat here, and that the site's likewise probably massively affected. Finally, there were also reports released on March 8th about destruction at Khosrabat, the third and last great Assyrian capital from the late 8th century BCE. Those reports have not yet been independently verified or are not documented in any way, so we really know what the situation at Khosrabat is. We should think about the motivation behind these acts. I think they have to do it, and I think what sets these activities in Assyria aside from previous assaults on cultural heritage sites is that these are deliberate acts widely broadcast by ISIS through propaganda videos and other posts on the internet. And I think we can essentially distinguish three basic audiences that ISIS wants to target through these actions. The first is sympathizers and potential sympathizers, both in the Middle East and in the West, to whom the organization wants to show that it faithfully reenacts iconoclastic acts ascribed in some traditions to Abraham or Ibrahim and the Prophet Muhammad. The second audience is the people of Syria and Iraq. During the rule of the Assads and Saddam Hussein, attempts were made by the governments of these states to create an identity across religions, sects, and ethnic groups by emphasizing the greatness of the pre-Islamic civilizations. We have heard about that in Margarethe van Esse's presentation. And this kind of nation building is, of course, anathema to ISIS with its idea of a caliphate. So this is another audience that's targeted with these videos. And finally, the videos are also addressed, so to speak, to us, to the people in the West. ISIS deliberately wants to inflict pain on the West in a way, which has, of course, always considered ancient Mesopotamia as also as part of its own cultural heritage and has heavily subsidized and supported archaeological work in all these places. What will the future bring? That's of course very hard to say. At this point, the most spectacular monuments on the ground in the Mosul region from the Assyrian period are essentially destroyed. Of course, it is possible that we will see more looting, and as this golden crown from one of the queen's tombs in Mosul shows, this would be extremely catastrophic if these sites were in fact further looted. Other sites might also be targeted. One possible target might be Ashur, but it should be said that there is no monumental art at Ashur, and so it seems less of a likely target and promising target than some of these other places. What can be done? This will be addressed later. Let me just say very few things, essentially reiterating what has been said before. Obviously, as long as ISIS is in control of large parts of northern Iraq and Syria, very little can actually be done. It's to be hoped that national governments, such as the Turkish government, is encouraged to better police its borders, to curb the illicit exploitation of antiquities. Whether that is high on the list of priorities of politicians, of course, is very much the question, and we hope so. We need to continue documenting the destruction. That, I think, is vital. And probably most importantly, we have to somehow support our colleagues from Syria and from Iraq the best we can, because they will be the ones who will be able to return one day to these places and to start the work that needs to be done at some point to do whatever can be done. I believe that resolutions, public resolutions in the West will actually not have any impact and will actually be probably rather counterproductive, since ISIS deliberately breaks taboos, would only motivate its supporters to engage in additional acts of destruction. And finally, since I'm speaking here as a scholar and in fact as an archaeologist interested in texts, I should say that as scholars we are facing, of course, a major dilemma with regard to the looting, which we all deplore, because the lost context is a catastrophe for our ability to reconstruct ancient history. But we also face now a volume of looting that is probably unprecedented, and I do believe that somehow these looted objects need to be documented. And I think we have to somehow detach the issue of documentation from the issue of property and ownership, however problematic in legal terms that may be. Thank you very much.